The morning mist clung to the Appalachian ridgeline like a widow's veil, thick and gray and suffocating. John Miller moved through it with the careful silence of a man who had learned long ago that the forest rewards patience and punishes carelessness. His boots, worn down to almost nothing at the heels, made barely a whisper against the carpet of dead leaves. The rifle across his shoulder was older than most marriages, its stock scarred and darkened by decades of use and weather. He had carried it through jungles half a world away, and now it was all he had left of the man he used to be. The trap he had set the previous evening should have held something by now. A deer, if luck was with him. A rabbit, if it was not. Either would do. John was not particular anymore. The days when he cared about such things had ended the same winter his wife died, the same season his daughter had packed her things and driven away without looking back. Now there was only the forest, the cabin, and the endless cycle of checking traps and cleaning game and staring at walls that held more ghosts than memories. He pushed through a cluster of mountain laurel, their twisted branches scraping at his jacket, and stopped. The trap was ahead, hidden in the small clearing where he had tracked deer signs for weeks. But something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier, and there was a sound, so faint he almost missed it beneath the rustle of wind through pine needles. A whimper. Human. John's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a rhythm he recognized from other times, other places where everything could change in the space between one breath and the next. He moved forward, each step deliberate, the rifle sliding from his shoulder into his hands without conscious thought. The trap came into view through the undergrowth, and what he saw there made him stop as surely as if he had walked into a wall. It was not a deer. It was not a rabbit. It was a child. A boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sat tangled in the steel jaws of the trap, his small wrist caught between the metal teeth that John had set with such care. The child's clothes were torn, streaked with mud and what might have been blood. His face was pale beneath the dirt, eyes wide with a terror so pure and absolute that John felt something crack inside his chest. The boy was shaking, his free hand pressed against the ground as if he might somehow push himself away from what held him. When the child saw John, he made a sound that was not quite a word, not quite a scream. His lips moved, forming shapes that took John a moment to understand. "Do not kill me. Please, do not kill me." John dropped to his knees beside the trap, his hands already working at the release mechanism, his mind racing through 100 questions that had no immediate answers. How had a child ended up here, miles from the nearest road, deep in wilderness where most adults would get lost within an hour? Who had left him? Why was he running? And from what? The boy flinched when John touched the trap, but he did not pull away. There was nowhere for him to go. John worked the mechanism carefully, talking in a low voice, the same tone he had once used to calm frightened animals. "Easy now. I am not going to hurt you. Hold still, just hold still." The trap opened with a metallic snap that seemed too loud in the quiet morning. The boy pulled his arm free and immediately curled into himself, cradling his injured wrist against his chest. John could see the marks where the steel had bitten into skin, deep bruises already forming. But the bones seemed intact. Small mercies in a situation that made no sense at all. John Miller had seen many things in his 63 years. He had seen men die in mud and rain. He had seen his wife waste away in a hospital bed, her hand growing lighter in his grip day by day. He had seen his daughter's face when she told him she could not stand to be around him anymore, that his silence and his distance had become walls she could not climb. But he had never seen anything quite like this. A child, alone and terrified, caught in a trap meant for animals, deep in a forest where no child should be. He reached out slowly, and the boy did not pull away. That, more than anything, told John how desperate the situation was. The child was too frightened to run, too exhausted to fight. John slipped his arms beneath the small body and lifted, feeling how light the boy was, how fragile. Like lifting a ghost. Like lifting everything he had failed to protect. As he turned back toward his cabin, John felt the weight of the forest pressing in around them. The mist had thickened, turning the trees into shadows, the path ahead into uncertainty. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, harsh and warning. John adjusted his grip on the child and began to walk, his rifle forgotten on the ground beside the trap. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. It might have been fear. It might have been purpose. He was not sure which frightened him more. The cabin sat in a hollow between two ridges, invisible from any trail, approachable only by those who knew where to look. John had chosen it for exactly that reason. He wanted to be left alone, wanted to disappear into the kind of solitude that made forgetting easier. The structure was small, built by someone long dead, its logs dark with age and weather. Inside, it held a wood stove, a cot, a table, and little else. It was not a home. It was a place to wait out the years until they finally ended. John kicked the door open and carried the boy inside, laying him carefully on the cot. The child had not spoken during the walk back, had barely moved, his eyes fixed on John's face with an intensity that was unnerving. Now, in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window, John could see him more clearly. The boy's hair was dark, matted with dirt and leaves. His face was thin, cheekbones too prominent, suggesting hunger that had lasted more than a day or two. The clothes were wrong, too light for the mountains, too worn to have been new recently. John found a clean rag and wet it from the water bucket by the stove. He cleaned the boy's arm as gently as he could, wiping away blood and dirt until he could see the full extent of the damage. The trap had left deep marks, but had not broken skin badly. The boy would have scars, but he would heal. Physically, at least. "What are you doing out here?" John asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Where are your parents?" The boy stared at him, and for a long moment, John thought he might not answer at all. Then, slowly, the child's mouth opened. "I ran away." "From what?" "The bad men." John felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What bad men?" But the boy only shook his head, his eyes filling with tears that he refused to let fall. John had seen that look before, in the faces of children in villages where war had come and gone, leaving only ruins and silence. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, who had learned that safety was a lie and trust was a luxury no one could afford. John sat back on his heels, studying the child. The boy could not have been more than 8 years old, but his eyes were older, carrying knowledge that belonged to someone who had survived things that should never have happened. John recognized it because he had seen it in his own mirror for years. Trauma left a mark that went deeper than any scar, changed the way a person looked at the world, turned every shadow into a threat and every silence into a prelude to violence. "What is your name?" John asked finally. "Ethan." "Ethan." John rolled the name around in his mind, testing it. "All right, Ethan. You are safe here. Do you understand? Nobody is going to hurt you." The boy, Ethan, did not look convinced, but he nodded anyway, a small gesture that was more about compliance than belief. John stood and moved to the stove, building up the fire, filling a pot with water to heat. The motions were automatic, giving his hands something to do while his mind worked through the implications of what he had found. A child, alone in the mountains, running from bad men, terrified, injured. John had lived in these woods for nearly 5 years, and in all that time, he had encountered perhaps a dozen people, all of them hikers or hunters passing through. The idea that someone was using this wilderness for something darker made his skin crawl. He thought of the trap, of how easily it could have killed rather than captured, and felt a surge of something he had not experienced in a long time. Anger. Hot and righteous and dangerous. Night fell like a hammer, sudden and complete. John lit a kerosene lamp and made a simple meal of canned beans and hard bread. Ethan ate mechanically, his eyes never leaving the door, his body tensed, as if ready to run at any moment. John did not press him with questions. He had learned in the war that sometimes silence was the only kindness you could offer, the only space where people could begin to feel safe. But safety was an illusion, and John knew it. If someone was looking for this boy, if there really were bad men hunting him, then they would come. The forest was vast, but it was not infinite. Tracks could be followed, signs could be read, and John had made no effort to hide their trail from the trap back to the cabin. At the time, he had not thought it mattered. Now, he realized it might be the mistake that cost them both everything. He checked his rifle, loading it fully, and set it within easy reach of the cot where he would sleep. Ethan watched him from the other bed, the boy's eyes reflecting the lamplight like a frightened animal. John wanted to say something reassuring, wanted to promise that everything would be all right. But he was too old and too experienced to make promises he might not be able to keep. Instead, he simply nodded at the boy. A gesture between men who understood that the world was not safe and never had been, and that sometimes all you could do was stand your ground and hope you were strong enough when the darkness came. The next 3 days passed in an uneasy calm. John went about his routines, checking traps, gathering firewood, hunting for small game. Ethan stayed close to the cabin, helping where he could, his movements careful and precise, like someone who had learned to be useful in order to survive. The boy spoke little, and John did not push. But slowly, in fragments and broken sentences, a story began to emerge. Ethan had lived in a city somewhere to the east. His parents were gone. He did not say how or when, and he had ended up in the care of his uncle. The uncle, it seemed, had been involved in things that were not legal. Ethan did not understand all of it, but he had seen something he should not have seen. Men in his uncle's house, arguing, money on a table, and then a gun and blood and screaming. His uncle had tried to protect him, had fought and lost. The men had taken Ethan, driven him far away, kept him locked in a basement somewhere in the mountains. He did not know where, but one night, a door had been left unlocked, and he had run. He had been running ever since. Days, he thought, though he had lost count. Sleeping under trees, eating berries and drinking from streams, driven by nothing but the certainty that if the bad men caught him again, they would make sure he never told anyone what he had seen. John listened to this story, spread across 3 evenings, delivered in whispers while the fire burned low, and felt his resolve harden into something cold and immovable. He had failed to protect his wife from death. He had failed to connect with his daughter before she left. But this boy, this frightened child, who had stumbled into his trap in his life, he would not fail. Could not. It was the first purpose he had felt since the war ended, and he realized that coming home did not mean the fighting was over. On the 4th night, everything changed. John woke to the sound of engines, distant but growing closer. He was on his feet before conscious thought kicked in, the rifle in his hands, his body remembering training that age had not erased. Ethan was already awake, sitting up in the cot, his face pale in the darkness. John held a finger to his lips, and the boy nodded, understanding without words. The engine stopped somewhere down the ridge. John moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. He could see lights, flashlight beams cutting through the trees, moving in their direction with the systematic precision of a search pattern. 3, maybe 4 of them. Professional, organized, exactly what he had feared. "We have to go," John said quietly. Now, he grabbed a pack, threw in supplies without thinking, grabbed the rifle and spare ammunition. Ethan was already at the door, waiting, trusting. John led them out the back, into the forest, moving with the automatic silence that had kept him alive in jungles and mountains half a world away. Behind them, the lights grew brighter, and he heard voices, men calling to each other, coordinating their approach. They moved through the darkness, John navigating by instinct and memory, heading deeper into the mountains where the terrain grew rougher and the trails disappeared. Ethan kept pace without complaint, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch John's jacket, a tether in the darkness. They climbed for what felt like hours, and when dawn began to lighten the sky, John finally allowed them to stop in a dense thicket of laurel where they could hide and watch their back trail. The men came an hour later. 5 of them, not 4. Armed with rifles and handguns, dressed in civilian clothes that did not quite hide their military bearing. They moved through the forest like hunters who knew their prey was close, spreading out, checking signs, communicating with hand signals. John watched them from cover, his rifle ready, calculating odds that were not in his favor. One of the men stopped near their hiding place, so close John could have reached out and touched him. The man's radio crackled, and a voice came through. "Anything? Not yet. But they are here. I found fresh tracks heading up the ridge. Keep looking. The boss wants the kid back today. No witnesses, no mistakes." The man moved on, and John felt Ethan's hand grip his jacket tighter. No witnesses. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. These men were not looking to take Ethan back to some foster system or juvenile facility. They were looking to eliminate a problem, and John had made himself part of that problem the moment he opened the trap. They stayed hidden for another 2 hours, not moving, barely breathing. The hunters eventually moved on, their search pattern taking them further up the mountain. When John was certain they were alone, he led Ethan down a different path, one that wound through creek beds and over rock faces where tracks would be harder to follow. They needed distance. They needed time. Most of all, they needed help. But help was a luxury John had given up years ago. The nearest town was 20 miles away, accessible only by rough logging roads. His cabin had no phone, no radio. He was as isolated as he had wanted to be, and now that isolation might be the thing that killed them both. They camped that night in a cave mouth, high on a ridge where John could see the approaches from 3 directions. He built no fire, allowed no light. They ate cold food from his pack and spoke in whispers, and for the first time since finding the boy, John felt the full weight of what he had taken on. He was 63 years old, alone, with a child to protect against men who were younger, better equipped, and motivated by the kind of desperation that came from having something to lose. Ethan sat beside him in the darkness, and after a long silence, the boy spoke. "Why are you helping me?" John did not answer immediately. He thought about his daughter, about the gulf that had opened between them after her mother died, about all the ways he had failed to be the father she needed. He thought about the war, about the children he had seen in villages, orphaned and scared and dependent on the mercy of strangers. He thought about the emptiness that had filled his days, the slow erosion of purpose that had brought him to a cabin in the woods to wait for death. "Because you need help," he said finally. "And because maybe I need a reason to still be here." Ethan considered this, his small face serious in the starlight. "Will they catch us?" John wanted to lie, wanted to promise safety and rescue and happy endings, but he was too tired for lies. "I do not know, but I am going to do everything I can to keep you safe. That is a promise." The boy nodded, and they sat in silence, 2 people who had lost everything and found each other by accident, waiting for the dawn and whatever it would bring. The hunters found them on the 6th day. John had known they would. The mountains were vast, but 5 men with resources and determination could cover a lot of ground. He had led them on a chase through some of the roughest terrain in the region, but eventually the odds caught up. They were crossing a valley, moving toward a ranger station John knew existed somewhere to the north, when the first shot cracked through the air. The bullet hit a tree beside John's head, bark exploding in a shower of splinters. He grabbed Ethan and dove behind a fallen log, his body covering the boy's, his rifle coming up to return fire. 2 more shots, then 3, coming from different angles. They were boxed in, pinned down, and John knew with sudden clarity that this was where it would end. He fired twice, methodical shots aimed at muzzle flashes, and was rewarded with a cry of pain. 1 down, 4 to go. His mind fell into patterns learned decades ago, calculating angles and cover, counting ammunition, planning moves that might buy them seconds or minutes, but probably not hours. Ethan was silent beneath him, trusting in a way that made John's chest ache. A voice called out from behind the trees. "Give us the boy and walk away. This does not have to be your fight." John did not bother answering. He shifted position, fired once more, and heard the impact of bullet on flesh. 2 down. The odds were improving, but not enough. He had 12 rounds left, maybe 13, and the men out there had no reason to rush. They could wait, could surround them, could take their time. Patience always won in situations like this. But John had one advantage they did not expect. He had nothing left to lose. His wife was gone. His daughter was gone. The only thing standing between him and the emptiness that had consumed his life was the terrified child pressed against the ground beneath his body, and he would be damned if he let them take that away. He rolled to his left, came up firing, dropped a 3rd man who had been trying to flank them. Ethan scrambled after him, moving when John moved, freezing when he froze, reading his intentions with the instinct of someone who had learned to survive by watching adults. They made it to a cluster of boulders. Better cover, higher ground. John's breath was coming hard now, his heart pounding, old wounds from old battles making themselves known. But his hands were steady, his aim true. The fourth man made a mistake, exposed himself for half a second too long, and John took the shot. He went down hard, and there was silence. One left, or maybe none. John waited, counting heartbeats, watching for movement. The forest had gone quiet, even the birds silent, as if holding their breath. Then, from behind them, a voice. John spun, but he was too slow, too old. The fifth man had circled around, was already there. His gun pointed not at John, but at Ethan. The man was young, barely 30, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. "Put down the rifle, old man." John froze. He could kill this man, probably, but not before the man killed Ethan. Mathematics of violence, simple and brutal. He lowered his rifle slowly, set it on the ground. His mind raced, looking for options, finding none. The man smiled. Smart choice. Now step away from the kid. John did not move. In his peripheral vision, he could see Ethan's face, pale and terrified, but also something else. Trust, absolute and unwavering. The boy believed John would protect him, would save him, and John realized with sudden, crystal clarity that he would rather die than betray that trust. He moved, but not the way the man expected. John lunged forward, not away, his body slamming into the gunman even as the weapon discharged. Pain exploded through his chest, white-hot and consuming, but momentum carried him forward. They hit the ground together, John's hands finding the man's throat, squeezing with every ounce of strength he had left. The man tried to bring his gun up, tried to fire again. But John was too close, his weight too much. They struggled in the dirt, two men fighting for their lives. And then Ethan was there, small hands grabbing a rock, bringing it down on the gunman's head with desperate force. The man went limp. John rolled off him, gasping, his hand pressed to his chest where blood was spreading across his shirt. He could feel the wound, could feel his strength draining away with every heartbeat. But Ethan was alive, safe, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Ethan knelt beside him, crying now, his small hands trying to stop the bleeding, trying to help in ways that were far too late. John reached up, touched the boy's face, left a smear of blood that looked black in the shadows. "You are okay," he whispered. "You are going to be okay." The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You are hurt. You cannot die. You cannot leave me." John wanted to promise that he would not. Wanted to tell the boy that everything would work out, that heroes always survived in the end. But he was bleeding out in the dirt of an Appalachian valley, miles from help, surrounded by dead men and the ruins of a fight he had won but would not survive. There were no promises left to make. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulled out a photograph that he had carried for years. It showed a young woman, smiling, her arm around a child who looked to be about Ethan's age. His daughter, taken 20 years ago, when she still looked at him with something other than disappointment. He pressed it into Ethan's hand. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice fading. "My daughter. You remind me of her, of what I should have protected." Ethan clutched the photograph, his tears falling onto the faded paper. "I do not want you to die." John smiled, or tried to. "Life is not about what we want, son. It is about what we do with the time we have. I spent years running from ghosts, from pain, but you gave me something to fight for. Something worth dying for. That is more than most people ever get." The world was growing dim around the edges, sounds fading, pain becoming distant. John could feel himself slipping away, and part of him was grateful. He was tired, so very tired. But before he went, he needed to know that Ethan would be all right. Needed to believe that this sacrifice meant something. As if in answer to an unspoken prayer, he heard them. Sirens, faint but growing louder. Vehicles approaching. Before the fight, when they had stopped at the creek to refill their water, John had found an old trail marker with information about ranger stations and emergency numbers. He had made a decision then, had used the radio from one of the hunters he had taken down earlier, had sent out a distress signal with their location. A last desperate gamble that rescue might arrive before the end. And it had, just not soon enough for him. "Police," he told Ethan. "They are coming. You tell them everything. Everything you saw. Everything you remember. Be brave. Be strong." Ethan nodded, clutching John's hand. "I will. I promise." The sirens grew louder, closer. John could see lights flashing through the trees now, blue and red, beautiful in their way. He squeezed Ethan's hand one last time, felt the small fingers squeeze back, and then let go. The world faded to gray, then to darkness, and John Miller, who had carried guilt and grief for so many years, finally laid down his burden and found peace. The police found them minutes later. They found John's body, and Ethan beside him, clutching a photograph and refusing to let go of a dead man's hand. They found the bodies of 5 men, all armed, all with records linking them to organized crime and human trafficking. And they found evidence, so much evidence, of a network that had operated in the shadows for years, preying on the vulnerable and disposing of witnesses. Ethan was taken to a hospital, treated for dehydration and exposure and trauma that would take years to heal. He told his story to detectives who listened with growing horror, and his testimony led to arrests that stretched across 3 states. The men who had taken him, who had killed his uncle, who had hunted him through the mountains, were brought to justice. And John Miller, the old man who had lived alone in the woods and died protecting a stranger's child, was buried with military honors in a cemetery overlooking the valley he had called home. Months passed. Ethan was placed with a foster family, good people who were patient with his nightmares and his silences. He attended school, made friends, learned to smile again. But every night before sleep, he looked at the photograph John had given him, at the woman named Sarah and her young daughter, and whispered a thank you to the man who had saved his life by giving his own. Spring came to the mountains, thawing the snow, bringing green back to the slopes. And in a clearing deep in the forest, a trap sat rusted and forgotten, no longer capable of holding anything. But it had held something once, something more precious than any animal. It had held destiny, purpose, redemption. It had caught a boy who needed saving and brought him to a man who needed a reason to believe that his life still mattered. John Miller had spent years running from his past, hiding from his pain, waiting for the end. But in his final days, he had found something worth living for, worth dying for. He had found proof that even the most broken among us can still be heroes, that even the most lost can find their way home. And in the end, the trap that was meant to catch dinner caught something far more valuable. It caught hope. It caught purpose. It caught a second chance for 2 souls who had both been lost in darkness and gave them each a brief, brilliant moment of light.